Hello and welcome to another edition of GNet TV's series of in-depth interviews and discussions. Today is August 23rd and we're delighted to have you with us. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director here at GNet TV, and it's my pleasure to moderate our discussion today on economic development in southern Vermont. We have a truly distinguished panel with us today that will unpack, I think, where we're going. Our panel today consists of Kevin Stapleton, an economist with the Vermont Department of Labor, who in addition to commenting on our regional economic situation will also be able to give us the larger statewide perspective as well. Bill Colvin is the Assistant Director of the Bennington County Regional Commission, or BCRC, as well as the Community Development Program Coordinator for the BCRC. He is also the Acting Director of the Bennington County Industrial Corporation. Matt Harrington is the Executive Director of the Bennington Area Chamber of Commerce, serving the Shires of Vermont region, and is no stranger to our viewers here at GNet, having made several appearances here on the show before. We're going to start off the discussion today by looking back at a report that was released about 2 years ago by a 9-member committee. It released a report called the Southern Vermont Economic Zone and looked at some of the issues that were in play in Bennington and Windham counties in particular. The report cited soft retail sales, lagging construction industry, and aging demographics as being some of the problems being faced here. So we're going to talk about that and see where we're at today, if 2 years or so since things are starting to improve a little bit. All right, so Bill, you were a member of that committee. I guess I was wondering, against that background 2 years later, how do things appear to be going to you? Are we still in trouble or are we trending in a better direction now?
Thanks, Andrew. I think we're fortunate. We have Kevin Stapleton here from the Department of Labor who can talk about, the statistics, many of which were referenced in the report, the aging demographic, the shrinking workforce population. So I think, I think we're still faced with many of those same challenges. I think what's been important since the report has come out is some of the efforts to combat those challenges. Specifically, the number one recommendation in the zone report was improved cooperation with the Windham region, looking to build off the work that had been done in Windham in the creation of a comprehensive economic development strategy and pursuing the same type of strategy across all of southern Vermont, the combined Bennington and Windham County. And on that front, I think there has been some significant progress, including the formation of what's known as the Regional Economic Development, or RED Group, in the Bennington region to serve as kind of a steering committee to work with the SEBEDS board that has been long established in the Windham region to do that work. So that's certainly a step. There's been an application to the United States Economic Development Administration to support the work of a joint Southern Vermont SEBS, and we were notified last week that we have cleared the first hurdle in that application process, which seems like good news towards the potential for an award to do that strategic planning effort across the Bennington and Windham region. So that was the primary recommendation of the Southern Vermont Zone report. It appears that progress certainly is being made on that front. I would note that the RED Group, while it's in its infancy and it's kind of feeling this long way, has made significant progress in terms of moving towards a more formal structure with a chair and vice chair coming from the civilian sector, if you will, not the people who do this every day, and having minutes and a regular meeting schedule. And I think one of the things that's come out of that RED Group discussion is the realization that regional economic development, at least as it pertains to Bennington County, really involves the need to both partner with the Windham region on broader initiatives, but also to improve the opportunities to cooperate within the Bennington region. We hear often kind of this distinction between the North Shire and the South Shire, and how do we better cooperate on economic development efforts. And I think we are, with the RED Group, with the work that the Chamber is doing. Matt and I just came from a North Shire chapter of a workforce and education committee. There had been one established through BCIC in the southern portion of the county. We're now establishing a northern chapter of workforce and ed and looking to kind of share best practices and as well as figure out what are the specific workforce development and education opportunities specific to the northern region. So I think we're making progress. I think we're following many of the recommendations of the zone report. This is long arc type of work. This isn't things that happen quickly. Although I will say, through the Workforce and Ed Committee and through the Red Group, folks are, perfectly attuned to looking for opportunities for the low-hanging fruit to things that can be done kind of short-term and right away.
I was wondering, Kevin, is that the perspective from Montpelier and up at the Department of Labor as well?
Yeah, the economy as a whole in Vermont has been good. There's been some limited job growth, but just like the rest of the state, and also to some degree as a snapshot of the rest of the country, the labor force in the southern half of the state has been declining, which provides fewer opportunities for people. As the labor market gets smaller, as lower incomes, a smaller share of the population is working. The unemployment rate, though, the percentage of people who can't find work, is historically right now very low. It's, I'm looking here, it's 3.8%. In 2016, it was 3.8% in Bennington. It was 3.3% in Windham. A little bit higher than the rest of the state, but far lower than the national average. So there are opportunities there, and typically when you have an unemployment rate this low, you start to see incomes rise as the demand for labor requires incomes to go up to attract people into the labor market. That is not happening as fast today as it has in the past, but we do see a little bit of progress there. The southern half of the state traditionally has slightly lower wages than the rest of the state, and that continues to be the case today. It is much more rural. When you include Chittenden County, and everything seems more rural, but it is much more rural than the rest of the state, and that makes it a little more challenging labor market because nationwide there's a trend of a lot of the job growth being in urban areas, and southern Vermont doesn't have an urban area, a large enough urban area to attract people. But overall, it is steady. We'd like to see the labor force participation rate, the portion of the population that's in the labor force, we'd like to see that go up. But you're fighting a trend that's not just southern Vermont, that's a national trend. So.
Well, that's a point I'd like to return to later, that whole labor force participation rate. It's kind of an interesting one as to what it takes to draw people back into the workforce who may have been discouraged for a long period of time being out of work. But let's come back to that in a minute or two. But first, I wanted to ask you, Matt, how do you see things playing out from your perspective down in Bennington with the chamber down there? I know you've been working hard at trying to develop a more regional approach to the chamber. Sounds like it sort of fits in with what Bill was saying earlier.
Well, and thanks for having me here. I think what's kind of neat about the whole story is as Bill was working in the idea between the SEDS and combining, we were kind of doing it a little bit in our own vacuum as a chamber to say, wow, the Manchester Chamber had fallen into bankruptcy. There's a great opportunity here for us to expand, not as a Bennington chamber, but more as a regional chamber. And I think you'll see that over the next couple of years that actually the Bennington chamber transforms into something completely new and different, even in its namesake. But we were kind of doing that, I don't want to say without complete knowledge of one another, but when we actually got together and started to talk about the potential of the North and the South coming together to work with what's sometimes been called a super region, which is the county, Bennington County and Windham County coming together to form a larger SEDS. We were very excited to know that the chamber was out there kind of paving some of that path already for Bill. And so Bill and I are now constantly working together, as he mentioned earlier, working today with the Workforce and Ed group of the North Shire. But I would say in general, and I guess from my perspective as a chamber, is constantly reminding our internal base that when I go outside and promote us as a region, that we are much more powerful together as a region than we are as single towns. And I know that makes kind of simplistic sense right now, but actually going into these towns and trying to convince people, and there's an old school way of looking at it and a new school way of looking at it, that's actually kind of what we're up against right now, which is there's a long, long history of believing that as a town, we were better off than as a region. And so I think some of our effort over the last year, and it'll continue to go right to 2020 is our full vision, that we're going to have to change people's perspectives and people's beliefs that when we start to market to a New Jersey and a Connecticut and a New Hampshire and New York and to the world to come visit the shires, and if you like the shires of Vermont so much, which is that north-south shire region, and you choose to live here, when we combine all those elements together, the mountains and the valleys, it makes for a very attractive story.
I was thinking one thing that has been kind of intriguing to me over the past few months, well, really the last couple of years since that economic zone report came out, is like, what are the factors that do drive economic development? I mean, there's some obvious ones, I guess you could say, like education, quality of government, natural resources. I mean, North Dakota went from being kind of an economic backwater to being one of the hottest places to be in the country when fracking and oil shale development took off a few years ago, and is now sort of seems to be kind of sliding back down again. But those are some obvious things. But I guess I just wondered, as you all look around and think, how do we grow the economic pie here in this area? Are there certain things that you think about, gosh, if we could only do this or do that, what would some of those things be?
Well, I think the easiest, not the easiest, the simplest answer, and perhaps one of the hardest things to accomplish is as the zone report called out, we need more people. We need more people in southern Vermont. In addition to re-engaging the portion of the labor force that has dropped out, we just need more people in the region. And that's a challenge. We have, there are jobs, we have employers within the region that are looking to add jobs. I mean, just in the last few weeks, through BCIC and the Vermont Training Program, we pulled down a $200,000 Vermont Training Program grant to assist NSK in Bennington in securing 325 jobs and cross-training those people. They're constantly looking for work. Mac Moline has announced they'd like to hire 50 to 100 new people in their Sunderland facility over the next year or so. Command Composites is adding an addition to its Bennington plant to take on a new line, which suggests additional employees there. And just coming from the Workforce and Ed Committee meeting, we heard from the Taconic Hotel and WCW in Manchester and Ken Axe at Brook Valley Appliance about this constant challenge of finding qualified workers. So I think the thing that would move the needle most significantly would be growing the population in southern Vermont. That is really difficult. I think as Kevin can attest, there hasn't been significant population growth in Vermont really, and in southern Vermont certainly, since the 1980s. So it's a challenge. And then you start looking at kind of larger macro political issues. So one way to increase the population would be through immigration. We all know, that's a word, on a national scale that, presents certain challenges, in certain people's minds. But, I don't know what the answer is. I do know that if we could increase the population by 3 to 5%, you would see a significant change in economic development in southern Vermont.
Is there any thoughts on that, Kevin, as to how we can possibly, amp up the number of people, able-bodied workers in the area?
No, it's a conversation we've had often, and the population in the southern half of the state is very slowly but declining, and it's a concern. And when we think of population dynamics, there's really only two sources: imports and exports of people moving in, people moving out of the state, and then people having children. And the birth rate is very low in Vermont, one of the lowest in the country, and it's not projected to change anytime soon. That's in part because of really good decisions that have been made across the state, education-wise. On the other hand, perhaps policy can have some influence on encouraging people to move here. It's a beautiful place to live. I think a lot of people who live here cherish the fact that it is a beautiful place to live and its rural nature is part of its draw. But the flip side of that is that, as was being said, we need more people. There's a lot of employers right now across the state, not just in southern Vermont, who can't fill positions. We don't have the workforce, the younger cohort of people moving into the workforce is very small relative to the cohort of people who are at the opposite end and retiring. And that presents a challenge for employers, and we hear about that every day from employers. So,
And one of the other things I hear frequently from people who are working is they're not making enough money.
well,
They're not able to buy a home, they're not able to support the kind of lifestyle they want. So there seems to be some kind of disconnect going on there. I mean, on the one hand, you've got employers of all kinds, looking for electricians, plumbers, carpenters, to engineers, and white collar workers of all kinds, and yet it seems like we're internally unable to generate those folks who are qualified for the jobs that are out there.
There's probably some truth to that, and higher paying positions, it's easier to entice people to come into the state. Lower paying positions, it's a challenge because, if you get offered a very high paying job, you might be willing to move for that. For a low paying job without a lot of job security, it's hard to envision moving, for a low wage job. And we need to bring people of all sorts into the state, people who are willing to work at all income levels, people with all levels of education. And employers feel that very acutely right now because with the unemployment rate at 3% or so, there's not a lot of room to grow in terms of the size of the labor force.
Yeah. And yet, as you said earlier, you would have thought that when the unemployment rate gets down to around 3%, that should put upward pressure on salaries and draw out, to return to the point you made at the start of our show, folks who have been discouraged, who have gotten laid off in the past and have been out of work for so long
when you said that earlier, it sparked a thought in my head, and I wanted to come back to it. But the declining labor force, there is a very small portion of the population that are these discouraged workers, people who lost their job, are unemployed, and have given up looking. But that is a very small portion of the labor force decline in the state, and also nationwide, but especially in the state. Most of the labor force decline in the state is attributable to the fact that, as a whole, we are older than the rest of the country, and getting older every day. The population in the southern part of the state is significantly older than the state as a whole, and so we have this large cohort of sort of retirement age people who are moving out of the labor force, who have worked 40 years, who are 65 or 60 or 70, whatever it is. And as they leave the labor force, that cohort that is so large and is living longer nowadays, as they leave the labor force, there's not as many young people behind them. So that the portion of the sort of labor force age, if you think of the working age population as, call it 20 to 65 or something, that population of people relative to the entire population of the state is getting significantly smaller. It's lost about 10 percentage points over the past, I think it's 20 years. So it's not just the fact that the labor force is getting smaller is in large part a demographic problem. People who came home from World War II had lots of children. We had the baby boomer generation. The baby boomers didn't have as many children. So you get this sort of bubble in the labor force that's now moving out.
Well, Matt, as the youngest person here at the table, what do you think it will take to attract millennials and other younger folks to come to Vermont? I mean, back in the 70s when I came to Vermont, I mean, that was part of a whole wave of people. Vermont was the cool place to come to, back to the land and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, what is it going to take now to draw folks of your generation to maybe think, wow, Vermont, that's where I want to go?
Yeah, I feel Kevin looking at me right now. He's waiting for the answer. Obviously not a silver bullet. I will say one of the exciting things, and I'd love to hear from Bill and Kevin as well about this. I think the silver lining in this, or the exciting part about this, is really having a bunch of really smart, good people at the table. working together and doing exactly what we've talked about all show, which is that cross collaboration, the cross pollination of ideas, whether that be North Shire, South Shire, or whether that be Bennington County, Windham County, or even having Kevin come down here from the state. I think we're getting a lot more access to our state government in the last couple months. I've even felt a lot more access, a lot more attention. As Bill mentioned, the grant that came down for workforce, but obviously we've also had the governor visit Bennington County 3 times in the last week. So we felt very fortunate for that as well. But I would say the exciting part is we really are, I think we've recognized and identified a lot of the problem that came out of that report. And then Bill and others, and myself included, have really tried to rally some different teams, different committees, different task force together to chop at all of these different elements. So I would say I'm a big believer in dealing with the brutal facts, but having unwavering faith that you'll succeed at the end. And we all have to have that around this table. Is, you know, it does seem dire, and Kevin always does bring us the statistics that are things we have to deal with. We have an aging workforce, and we have a workforce that should be in its prime. Millennials, they make up the majority of the workforce right now, and by 2025 they'll make up 75% of the workforce. So the idea that, I mean, millennials are the largest demographic in terms of generations when we look at them. They're larger than baby boomers. So we should be asking, as Vermonters, you know, yes, we're aging out of the baby boomer era of Vermont, but man, we should be aging into the millennial generation, which is 93 million people in America. So why can't we get some of those? So I think we also have to be, but we've got to be dealing with the brutal facts. And I know these guys around the table and others that are around those tables are dealing with some of those brutal facts, but still having that unwavering faith. I think one of the biggest things, and this does, I mean, I think you could ask any one of these gentlemen around the table, there are things that keep you up at night. And these guys have a heart, and I have a heart for trying to solve these problems. One of them, for me personally, is how do I get people of my generation, you know, the people that are 17 to about 37 right now, into this state, and how do we do it? I always feel it's a race against time, you know. They're out there, and we may be able to convince them. We just can't take 20 to 30 years to convince them that Vermont is a beautiful state. We're really up against the clock. One of the biggest things that I've seen, and I'll continue to encourage it, I think it happened with me, and I give credit to my board, is you gotta start hiring young leaders in positions that can make decisions. It's not just about hiring young people. It's about, you know, I think about Zerwatt, who just took on our community development position in Bennington. And that was a great, bold move by the town of Bennington to say, we're gonna hire this young woman, ethnically diverse person into this position. That's very important. I think about Bill with his hire of Jonathan Cooper and Michelle Morocco, hiring young people that can make decisions and move it forward. I think even in my position, where we've seen that with the chamber and that be successful, is looking at a new regional area guide. I think if you go to our website, it's very, I would say, millennial friendly, bright and bold and modern. And even our partnership with the New England newspaper, where we've partnered together to create the Go Shires VT app, which is, we know from a chamber perspective and from a tourist perspective, they don't always want to be carrying around the area guide anymore. They're more on their mobile devices. And so how, as a chamber, are we pushing that innovation? How are we innovating at that verge of an older generation and a new generation, and how are we kind of overlapping our efforts? So, but that happened because I was there and we could make those decisions, and I had the authority to make those. So I would say part of our ability to attract young professionals and millennials is putting young professionals and millennials somewhat in charge of certain areas, so that we're just generally going to change a Vermont. And Vermont has to be ready for change, which sometimes is a struggle for Vermont.
No kidding. I find myself wondering if there's going to come to be some kind of tipping point where, you know, the aging of the workforce is going to be so extreme that things will start not being done. I mean, I was talking with our local fire chief last week, who tells me that the average age of his volunteer fire department is 53 years old. I mean, that's getting to the point where some of these guys probably shouldn't be going into burning buildings and fighting fires. And you kind of wonder, well, okay, if that keeps going for enough time, what happens then? Maybe we just go to a professional fire department.
And those are things I think we do have to explore, instead of saying, well, Vermont has always had a volunteer base, and now these darn millennials, they don't volunteer, so what do we do? As opposed to thinking outside the box and saying, okay, so that's not where that talent is best suited. It may mean that we have to hire firefighters. I know we have the Garlic Fest coming up. We have an amazing amount of volunteers. One of my big fears, we have over 100 volunteers that help us with Garlic Fest. They're all reaching that 50 to 60-year-old point and won't be able to do that. And I'm not sure that this next generation views that same type of volunteerism. I think they believe in social responsibility. I believe they volunteer in different ways. They just may not volunteer like we used to. And so we've got to find out new and innovative ways to get them on board.
Well, as Matt was mentioning, Bill, the governor has been down and was in Bennington last week, and with checkbook in hand, apparently, with a nice little contribution towards a big project that you're closely involved with, the Putnam Block development, which sounds like it's making great progress and really sounds like a transformative thing for Bennington, which, when it's successful, not if, but when, sounds like it might be one of those steps that will really have a major ripple effect throughout the entire county.
Well, certainly that's that's the intent, and not to go into great detail, but we're talking about the renovation, adaptive reuse, and construction of new construction on 4 acres in the heart of downtown Bennington. At this point, we're talking about the renovation of 4 historic structures and the construction of 2 brand new 4-story buildings, about a $55 million project in a couple of phases. And I think what's perhaps as important here is the fact that this project really stemmed from key anchor institutions within the community stepping up and recognizing the need for the private sector to be involved in economic development in a meaningful way. So the medical system, Bennington College, Southern Vermont College, the Bank of Bennington, and it really has grown into other local professionals and individuals who have really seen the importance of kind of revitalizing the urban core in a community. I think often when people are asked, how is your community doing economically, kind of the thing that people snap to is, what's your downtown look like? What's it feel like? Is it vital? Is it active? Are people living there and shopping and eating and doing kind of working there? And really that's what this project is intended to do, is really kind of breathe new life into old buildings, many of which upper floors haven't been utilized since the late 1970s, and really create some new construction that allows for retail, new restaurants, significant office use from these anchor institutions and others. And I think perhaps most importantly, new market rate residential in the downtown. One of the things we haven't talked about, which I think is absolutely critical to attracting the millennial demographic to our areas, having the right type of housing. Housing is a key building block of economic development. Having it be affordable and the type of housing that is attractive. And certainly, if you look at national trends and reports and surveys, we know that kind of that more urban, walkable environment, housing, not necessarily the house on 2 acres, seems to be more attractive to a fair portion of the millennial demographic. It also happens to be the type of housing which is attractive to people at the other end who are kind of aging out of taking care of the big house, who may be empty nesters, who may not want to take care of that big yard anymore. So certainly I can attest to the fact that where we're seeing interest in what could be 50 to 70 new housing units on this block is kind of at both ends of the spectrum. Young people who are looking to relocate to the area. I'm getting calls frequently from new employees at Vermont Country Store or at Orvis who are coming to the area for jobs and are looking for this type of housing, which doesn't yet exist in the North Shire, although they're, through zoning changes and other, really looking at efforts to try to create that type of environment. But that kind of urban walkable environment is really attractive to people in kind of both ends of the spectrum, and we think it's going to be an important addition to the area.
Well, you raise an interesting point, and I've heard about affordable housing, the lack of it, the need for it around here for so long. It always has kind of puzzled me as to why aren't some of those construction contractors or builders out there building more housing, which clearly there seems to be a demand. Is it just that it's not profitable enough to build a house for, I'll just throw out a number, $100,000 or something that is affordable for somebody who's not making six figures yet? I mean, is that the problem, or is there something more to it than that?
No, I can tell you that's absolutely the problem. So the traditional real estate development economics just don't work in a rural environment like ours. By way of example, phase one of the Putnam Block redevelopment, $24 million in the adaptive reuse of 3 historic buildings. We just got the appraisal, post-completion appraisal. $24 million in, when we cut the ribbon on day one, it's worth $7.5 million. Now that is not the type of model that is attractive to an outside developer. So you have to get really creative about how to do these projects. That's why you need grants like the Community Development Block Grant that the governor came down to award. That's why you need new market tax credits. That's why you need historic renovation tax credits. And that's why you need community-enabled investment through anchor institutions and charitable-minded people who believe in the community. That's how you backfill that 2/3 of the value, which is not, 2/3 of the cost, which is not supported by the underlying value. So again, by way of example, in the Putnam project, to get to kind of a static situation where it would make sense for a developer to come out without those types of incentives, rents would need to be $40 to $55 per square foot. Current rents in Bennington are $8 to $10 a square foot. So that's the gap, and that's the challenge, and that's why housing developers are not coming here, because without these types of creative programs, the math just does not work.
So Kevin, this is probably a good question for an economist from the Commerce Department, but since we have you here today, it sounds like then there's a big role for the state to play in trying to narrow that gap that Bill was referring to. But is it your sense up in Montpelier that there's the will or the financial capacity to make that happen? I mean,
well, the governor just, I think it's been signed into law now, the $35 million for housing. That will probably start to put a small dent into the problem. But there's also, part of what drives housing prices is the regulatory environment around it, and zoning laws and all that, and that presents another struggle at the local level. Everybody wants to have more affordable housing, and also doesn't want to see their own housing value go down. So in terms of policy, I don't know what policies will solve that, but it is an issue across the state, and housing values relative to incomes in the state. Housing values are high and housing costs are very high in the state relative to incomes compared to the nation as a whole. There are obviously places that are worse, but we do have high housing costs, and the state through VHCB and through this new bond that the governor advocated for, that will hopefully play a role in putting a dent in it, but it's a large hole to fill.
Mm. I mean, I guess I find myself wondering sometimes if we're that different from other parts of the country, other rural states. I mean, I got to believe that other rural states, like in the Midwest or farther west, where there are similar, issues around this urban-rural divide, and younger folks sort of, migrating to cities and urban environments, and housing values being a tough nut to crack in certain places. Vermont is not alone, I guess, in facing this, I would assume, or are we?
No, it's certainly not alone. But our housing prices relative to our incomes are higher. In the Midwest, in rural areas in the Midwest, housing prices aren't as high. The other thing that probably plays a big role in this is that our housing stock is much older than the rest of the nation. And older housing stock means lack of insulation means lack of energy efficiency. So all of that drives housing costs in this state to be higher than areas in the Midwest where housing values relative to income. You were talking about South Dakota earlier. I don't have the exact number in front of me, but I would gander a guess that the average housing price, median housing price in South Dakota is probably 25% lower than Vermont. So that plays a role.
Well, one of the things that, again, we've heard a lot of over the years is quality of life in Vermont, and in particular recreational opportunities in Vermont. And I guess I was wondering, Matt, to kind of get to your point about how do we draw younger generation folks and millennials here. I mean, recreation has usually been identified as like one of our assets. We've got mountains to hike and rivers to kayak in, and mountains to ski down, and all of that. In your work at the chamber, are you able to kind of leverage that into a tool that will say to those folks, hey, you ought to check us out?
Sure, and I think the bigger part is crafting a narrative that's attractive to the market, and hopefully our market is the younger population. And I usually joke around and saying, look, we're in the era of Bernieism, which is that, look, the world is only getting more volatile, uncertain, complex, and confusing. And I think Vermont has a charming narrative and Southern Vermont especially, has a charming narrative that hopefully we're putting out there as a chamber, but we need to collectively put out there as a southern tier of the state saying, look, if you want to get away from the chaos and away from kind of the volatility that's happening all around the world, and I'm talking even just this year, we can go back and look back at all the chaos that is happening. I think we can begin to craft a story that says, come up to Vermont, and we've done that through obviously website and using social media and that sort of thing. But we're even doing that with, we just worked on a larger contract with Amtrak, which is people can leave Penn Station, buy one single ticket, end up at Rensselaer train station, hop on the Shire's Vermont shuttle, and be whisked away all the way to Vermont, and making a stop in Bennington and 3 stops in Manchester. Those types of initiatives where we create less friction to enter the state is very important. And so while I'm out there, and I'll go to probably 6 to 10 travel shows this year, and we did one in New York City in the beginning in January, and I'll tell you that the number one comment is, oh, Vermont, that's 6 hours away. And I go, no, Vermont's 3 hours away. Burlington is 6 hours away. Bennington, Vermont, and Manchester, Vermont is only 3, and all of a sudden their eyes light up, and then I say, oh, and have you looked at the Amtrak schedule, because we can put you up there, and it's a one ticket, it's very frictionless, and we get you right up there. And within the Shires of Vermont, you can ski on one day, you can shop on the next, you can go to fine dining, you can go to a local homegrown food the next day, you can come down and see a world-class theater, you can go to museums, and you can be outside and hike Bald Mountain. That is the narrative that we need to be putting out there. So I guess in a roundabout way to get back to your question is, recreation has been huge for Vermont. I think now if we tweak it and point it in the right direction, it becomes even more attractive, because it's about bringing sanity back to people's spirit, I think, a little bit.
Yeah, when we were doing the Southern Vermont Zone report, we did a fair amount of surveying of different, workforce groups, employers, and people visiting the area. And I think kind of the thing that really jumped out as being attractive and why people really loved Southern Vermont, and the word kept coming back and back and back, was authenticity. And I really think it's, recreation is a component of that. And I think Matt did an excellent job kind of summarizing, what a week spent in Southern Vermont may look like. But I think we really need to focus on that word of, and it's an authentic experience. It's not crafted, manufactured. It's just, life in an area, and you really can come here and could just kind of feel like you pick up and become, a local for however long you're here. So I think that's an important message.
And let me piggyback on that because that word is synonymous with millennials. And I've been studying millennials for over a decade now in various occupations. And when we talk about millennials, they're looking for genuine, they're looking for authentic. And I think that's why certain people rose to political fame and celebrity fame. Because they exude that, and I think that's a great point that Bill brings up about Southern Vermont of saying, come enjoy the authenticity of America, come enjoy the authenticity of Vermont and being, recreation and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. And maybe have Bernie run for president again, so get Vermont out there all the time.
Yes, right.
Probably was a kind of a boost for the state's tourism industry, I wouldn't be surprised. Before we go, I just wanted to ask about one other thing that just happened earlier this week. That I don't know if it's going to have a big impact here in southern Vermont, but I know there's one project over in Mount Snow that might be affected by it, and that's the feds kind of coming down on the state's EB-5 program. As many folks know, that's a program that offers folks seeking green cards to the U.S. They stump up, I think it's $500,000, and a project creates 10 jobs. They're able to get an accelerated green card. And as we've also been hearing a lot about over the past couple of years, major, I guess scandal is the right word, with the JPEAK project. A couple of developers there are going through a legal process now, trying to unravel what happened at JPEAK and a couple of other projects that have been described as Ponzi schemes. So the result of that being that the feds came along early this week and are recommending that the state close down its regional EB-5 center. Kevin, is this something that we need to worry about? Is the EB-5 program something that was kind of, aside from the JPEAK situation, helping the state's economy and producing jobs, or was it just sort of not being well run?
I can't speak to whether overall it helped or hurt. I can tell you that in the JPEAK area and around Burke, jobs were certainly created. Whether that means that the trade-off is worth it or not, I have no opinion on that. And I really, it's a very complex question. And I will stay out of any discussion of
The only EB-5 project I'm aware of in southern Vermont is the one at Mount Snow. Are there any others that are in Bennington or Manchester? I'm not aware of any.
No, and I will tell you, as kind of as you might imagine, a project like the Putnam project, we're looking at, I think, in phase one, 11 or 12 different funding sources to bring this project to fruition. The group had talked about EB-5, and I think made a conscious decision until things kind of settled down. That even before the closing of the regional center, but certainly the news out of the northern part of the state had broken. We were aware of the challenges Mount Snow was facing in getting approvals. So I'm afraid that in some minds, certainly I can speak, for this project in Bennington. In some minds, I'm afraid that kind of EB-5 is off the table when it could be a viable tool in a state really that needs every possible tool to incent the right type of economic development. So I think it's an unfortunate. I think the whole thing is unfortunate. I do think there probably are additional hurdles, both in practically and in mindset, in terms of drawing down EB-5 money for projects in Vermont at this point.
Which is ironic because Senator Pat Leahy was one of the big proponents of the program in its earlier years, and on its face it seemed like a pretty, viable kind of thing, but clearly not happening for a while, or I guess it's being wound down. It's not going to. The recommendation is not to shut it down completely overnight, but to let the projects that are already underway finish up and then perhaps
through the regional center. I mean, in theory, EB-5 money is still available to Vermont from other avenues through the national center. I think one of the the challenges, it's not just in Vermont. The program's only authorized through September 30th. There are national discussions, I think, to be had on a number of types of programs going forward, including EB-5.
Okay.
I think one of the things that we have to, maybe the long arc of all of this is that we need to know that we're moving to a knowledge-based economy, and so we do need some of that help to bring people in to help with some of the more labor or things that we as even millennials, as we've been talking all day long, which is that eventually we will have to understand that America and even Vermont has to move to more of enticing that knowledge-based economy. And so I think when we look at the future, one of the exciting things that I've heard Bill talk a little bit about, but obviously a green cluster economy. And that, again, that's going to take a lot of knowledge-based people. It's going to take a lot of labor-based people. But I think we have to, we need to be sensitive to the fact that we may be moving out of a large-scale, labor-intensive nation and moving more to a knowledge-based. And so, how do we work with that and still allow tools where labor is needed? That door is open for us as well.
Which prompts a final question, Kevin. Is the state working with some of the state colleges to try and retain graduates, like
Sure.
places at UVM or other
Yeah.
colleges, to say, hey, why don't you, before you think about going off to New York or Boston or Washington, why don't you think about staying here in Vermont?
There's a couple tracks there. One is a series of grants called TACT grants, and when I say TACT, I should know the acronym, and it's not coming to me right now. But these are grants that help Vermonters get training and education in programs that are in high demand. We have one with VTC. We've had one in the past with CCV. I'm not sure if that one's still current. University of Vermont. This is more domestic, encouraging people who are here to gain the skills they need to get that next position. And those are all related to jobs that have been lost due to trade adjustment, because the first two letters in TACT is trade adjustment. So those programs have helped train and educate a lot of Vermonters into skills that are in high demand, positions that are in high demand. In terms of working with the colleges and universities to retain the people who are here, I'm not familiar with the exact programs, but I know they exist. And that's really, in some ways, when you look at the end of the population spectrum on the educated end, the university system, the college system, the state is disproportionately out-of-state people. The University of Vermont is something like 75% out-of-state people, and the rest of the state college system, due in part to just the smallness of the state, has a larger population of out-of-state people. So one strategy is, of course, to work hard to retain those people. And I know that the people at the Agency of Commerce and Community Development are trying to encourage that, but I'm not familiar with the exact programs.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's also a double-edged sword, because as we're trying to attract people to stay right out of college, right into Vermont, I think, one, we all remember being young and knowing that we need to get out and explore the world. And so there's that general need as a 21, 22, 23-year-old that needs to get out and explore, and yet we're trying to fight that natural tendency. I think we have to be careful that we go down that road, instead looking at maybe the boomerang effect, which is that 27, 8, 9-year-old who went to Brooklyn, went to San Francisco, got an amazing amount of skills, and now has a girlfriend, wants to settle down, wants that white picket fence approach, and Vermont offers that. Even if we look at, wow, we're really trying to attract college people to stay here, and especially in southern Vermont, then is southern Vermont ready to see that culture change on them? Because if you keep a 21, 22, 23-year-old, let's be very literal here, then your bars are going to stay open till 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, and 3 o'clock. And Vermont has to decide, is that something that it wants to do? Because that's what a 21, 22, and 23-year-old demand. If that's not, or there's a way that we could meet halfway, I think it's the boomerang approach, which is now they've kind of gotten that all out of their system in some of the more urban settings, and have come back, and now they want to start that family, and Vermont offers a perfect space for that.
But I do think the key to doing that, and I agree with Matt 100% about, the key is imprinting while they're here.
Yes.
That's an opportunity and an option, and really showing that path back to Vermont after their time kind of out sowing their wild
And we've
oats,
talked
if you will.
about that with Bennington College, to say, okay, on your 10-year anniversary reunion, how is the chamber, how is Bill's agency, how are we working with Bennington College or Southern Vermont College when they do invite that 10-year reunion back, that we're offering kind of a, do you remember this place? And can we invite you back, and can we create kind of a, again, that story, that narrative, craft that in their mind?
There's also, it's partly, I think it's just an easier conversation to have, but with people in college and coming out of college and people who are college bound, you can talk about once they graduate from college, do they come back, all that. But there's also a large segment of the population that's not going to be at a four-year institution, and those people need jobs here as well, and we need to create an environment where they have the skills or can gain the skills without getting a four-year degree. What types of training programs and workforce development programs can we create to encourage those people to stay, to create an environment where people without a college degree but who have some high skills training and stuff can find positions here, can make a wage here that is enough to encourage them to live here. I think this conversation, and for good reason, this conversation usually falls to talking about college graduates, but a large portion of the workforce, a large portion of our current labor needs is not people with college degrees. It's people with a very specific set of skills and training. In part, that's what TACT attempts to do, is pull in people who just need a little bump up in skills to get into stable jobs that they can feel good about and be in for a long time and build a career around, as opposed to sort of employment hopping from job to job on a seasonal basis or something.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think what's pointed out in this discussion is really the sheer complexity of trying to move the needle on an economy and how many building blocks actually go into this. So, there's quality jobs, there's education and training, there's the appropriate housing, there's infrastructure, there's the whole quality of life, the cultural and recreational and entertainment components. All of these things really have to fit together in this kind of complex matrix for you to really have an economy that hums. And if any one of those things is kind of lacking, it makes things much more challenging. So you're really trying to pull together this complex puzzle, all of these pieces all at the same time. And there just aren't really any easy solutions. You try to pick things off and make incremental progress on the things that you can while you can, all the time keeping in mind, there are all of these other things which have to be brought to bear.
Can I say one more thing to bring it back around to a lighter note? Because when I initially provided some of these data points, Matt, I started to feel like I was the Dark Lord or something because Matt pointed out how. But the flip side of the fact that the labor force is shrinking relative to the population and that older people are dying is that it provides tremendous opportunity for people who are looking for work at every education level, at every skills level. Young people, there will be a lot of opportunities for young people in the state in the coming years as the older population retires. All of these positions become available, and the job market is changing and the skills required are changing, and we can encourage young people either to come here or to stay here based on these new jobs that are being created or that are opening up as people retire. So it's not just the Dark Lord, it's also
We like your Dark Lord.
Yeah, that's all right.
No, I was just talking, and this is anecdotal, I was just talking to a young woman, she's probably 28, 29, had a choice to go to a larger market and in her industry and take a job where pretty much she would have been so narrowly focused in her job, but because she went to a niche boutique firm in Vermont, had all of this. And then then all her friends came back and they visited her up here in Vermont, and the amount of knowledge, wealth, experience, just even the idea that she had to get up and present and lead teams and be a leader in her industry in Vermont, was well beyond what her friends were experiencing in that little Manhattan place on the 48th floor that no one knows about. So I think you're absolutely right, Kevin, that look at the innovation at the verge, which is when you get into clusters of urbanization, there's not a lot of opportunity for young people. When you start to go out to the fringe part, say Vermont, there's a lot of opportunity for young people.
Well,
that's an advertisement that should write itself
Yeah.
to encourage people to come here. That's a great story.
Well, on that cheerful note, then we'll have to bring this conversation to a close. But I want to thank you all for making the time available today to come down and talk about all these really important points for the future of the state. I want to thank Bill Colvin, Matt Harrington, Kevin Stapleton for being with us today, and thank all of you as well for being with us. Hope you've enjoyed the show, and we'll see you again the next time.